Thanks. Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's Healthcare IT News webinar, Making Sense of the Cloud's Confusing Shared Responsibility Model, sponsored by ClearDATA. My name is Mike Milliard. I'm the editor of Healthcare IT News, and I will act as today's moderator. During this webinar, you'll learn the details of what information you can access and where the responsibility for your data resides throughout the data lifecycle. It's meant to help you gain important insights into the shared responsibility model for the various types of healthcare cloud computing, as well as the benefits and risks of each. Our speaker for today's event is Chris Bowen. Chris is the founder and Chief Privacy and Security Officer at ClearDATA. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Chris.
Thanks, Mike, and thank all of you for spending a few minutes with us today. As Mike mentioned, we're going to try to weave our way through what can sometimes be a confusing shared responsibility model when you are contemplating a workload with regulated data, for example, PHI, in the cloud. So we're going to talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities, some data or service models for deployment of cloud, breach reporting, etc. Specifically, we want to really kind of take a refresher on HIPAA. We won't get too far into the weeds there, but the shared security model, shared responsibility model does have some interdependencies with the business associate agreement, the security rule, etc. So we will try to navigate some of that. We're going to try to help you understand some of the key roles in data ownership and how that relates to the shared responsibility model. We'll go through and help you understand those service models, the deployment models. Again, we won't drive too much into those details, but we will try to discuss at least the advantages, the benefits, the disadvantages of each model and help you align those models with some of the HIPAA security requirements as well. And then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. So let's start really on the business associate agreement. We know that the HIPAA security rule, the privacy rule, and the breach notification rule, these were designed to give patients certain rights. And we certainly know that HIPAA was designed to make insurance information portable. And over time, that's really evolved to be more inclusive of the patient rights to receive a notice of their privacy practices, for example, to copy and inspect their own health information. If they need to make an amendment, they have a right to do that. And certainly they have a right to complain about the mishandling of their information, among other rights. These rules were really designed to help facilitate the rights, as you know, but the BAA, the Business Associate Agreement, became a requirement for cloud providers when the Omnibus rule was codified in 2013. So at that point in time, we started to see public cloud providers start to sign the Business Associate Agreement. Now, a lot of those Business Associate Agreements are designed for a specific kind of cloud deployment or a service model, and so they weren't always, nor are they today, always really inclusive of what a healthcare provider or a business associate really needs from a shared responsibility model all the way up through the stack, if you will. And we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that. As we know, the Business Associate Agreement has always been a requirement of a covered entity. We know that the Omnibus called that out. And there's really an obligation now as well that the business associate has an agreement of their own with the subcontractors. And so again, there's really three major obligations of the BAA. Patient is the center of this, and we're trying to facilitate the rights. So some of these rights are enabled by ensuring that a risk analysis is completed, policies and procedures are complete. We're trying to really protect the data and safeguard that data, as well as to outline some of the breach reporting requirements in the event of a security incident that involves a data breach. So at a high level, just a couple of details around the breach reporting. Again, I won't spend a ton of time here, but for less than 500 records in a breach scenario, those have to be logged. Anything more than 500 records must be reported to the Department of Health and Human Services. And this one really is a refresher on the fines and penalties. If you visit the Wall of Shame, you'll see certain incidents that have had to be shared with the public, and the fines for those are quite steep, up to $1.5 million. If you have a known vulnerability and you wouldn't normally have had the opportunity to know about that, your fines are a lot less, all the way up the chain of neglect. So if you, for example, have a control that you have willfully neglected that caused a breach, but then corrected it, it's a higher fine. But finally, if you willfully neglect your duty to safeguard data, and you did not correct that issue, well, you get the Mac Daddy of the fines, plus you get a plaintiff attorney or a class action attorney starting to use words like gross negligence and punitive damages and those kinds of things. So those kinds of things can really make a covered entity or a business associate have a tough day. There's the slide, just in time to move on. So let's talk about the key roles in data ownership. Now that we've kind of had a refresher on some of those business associate types of discussions, getting back to the data for a minute, all of this leads into a shared responsibility model and how we share that responsibility to safeguard the data through the journey. So in order to do that, we have to really know who has responsibility for the data. A lot of times I hear folks say, hey, I'm hosting data somewhere, and my cloud provider has all the responsibility. Well, the fact is actually that the data owner, down at the bottom of the screen, once that renders, actually holds all of the legal rights and the complete control over the data and its elements. So the data owner can certainly delegate stewardship or processing responsibilities to others. They actually might even delegate custodial responsibility, for example, to a cloud provider that would be responsible for the custody of that data, certainly implementing processing rules and other things. Ultimately, however, the data owner still has the legal responsibility and the liability for that data. So you can never fully transfer that responsibility to somebody else. And so data owners need to be very diligent in how they choose their partners along that journey. And again, a cloud provider would usually be considered in this model a data custodian. A covered entity, a hospital, for example, a healthcare provider, would likely be the data owner, and the business associate would either be a data processor, a data controller, a data custodian, other types of roles there. It's just really important to know the role that you have as it relates to patient data. So since we've level set a little bit on the foundation around the business associate, but since we have level set on the foundation around the business associate agreement, some of the roles around the data ownership, we can now start to relate that foundation to the various cloud deployment and service models that we see in the marketplace today. So as we start to think about that, the responsibilities will vary depending on whether you choose to place your workload in an infrastructure, a platform, or a software as a service model. And we'll get a little bit more detailed about that here in a few minutes. Oh, I see once we complain about a slide not showing up quickly, it shows up quickly. I like it. Okay, so this is really the cloud reference model. In this model, there's lots of different parts, lots of different moving pieces. Your cloud provider really needs to be focused on enabling you to have your workload in the cloud, but I'm going to go through some of these parts of the model. Certainly you have the cloud consumer up there in the top left. That would be anybody who's trying to consume services, whether that's a business associate, a covered entity, other types of customers. A lot of times those customers will bring with them their own types of auditors, their own types of folks to help with the assurance that the security, the privacy, the controls that are in place. Maybe that's from a HIPAA perspective, maybe that's from an ISO perspective, perhaps it's an FDA perspective. There's lots of different models here that we can think about as it relates to privacy, security, performance, those kinds of things. So a customer will bring with them usually their own auditor to help with that assurance. If you don't have one, you might want to think about getting somebody to help you in that journey. Down at the bottom of the stack, you have the physical resource layers. You have the abstraction and the control layers that really take and join the physical to the logical. Those are typically provided by the retail public cloud providers, and can certainly be a private cloud model as well. And I'm sorry for those of you who may not be seeing these slides. We'll try to get that worked out. As you climb the stack a little bit, you have a service layer, and this is really becoming where the level where you have the infrastructure as a service, the platform as a service, the SaaS, which is the software as a service model. That's really where your workloads will sit, and that's really where we're going to dive into a little bit more detail. But just wanted to make sure you were level set on the cloud model. Cloud service management really involves managing some of the business side, managing some of the portability, perhaps interoperability. This is really where business associates are really useful in helping the covered entity, for example, with some of those business requirements. And then finally, a cloud provider certainly needs to be focused on security and privacy. That's we call that table stakes. That's something that you actually have to really focus on, and we'll get more into the details of that in a moment. And a great comment from one of our listeners. I am, by the way, on slide 15, and the slides are available in the far right icon. So I'll try to list out the slides due to the error in the platform. Now I'm on slide 16. So at, again, a high level, some of the cloud deployment models could be private cloud, community cloud. This, for example, is where you might have some aligned interests, and so you create a cloud that you can all share information on or share resources with. Hybrid cloud is certainly a combination of those models, and something we've seen for several years that is starting to gain massive adoption is the public cloud, where you have players like Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services, and to some degree Google as well. All right, now I'm on slide 18. We're going to talk briefly about the cloud service models, and then we're going to get into a little bit more depth. From an IaaS perspective, with the cloud models, you'll start to see at the bottom here the IaaS, the infrastructure as a service model. And this is really where you can begin to deploy a workload, where you can have control of the operating system, the storage components, some of the networking around the solution. Of course, all that's made possible by the underlying facilities, the hardware, the internet connectivity, the integration of the virtualization, the abstraction layers. Then you move up that a little bit, and you start to see application programming interfaces tie some of the infrastructure to the platform. These will allow you to orchestrate, which really just simply means manage, deploy, provision, automate, securely automate, in some cases, different workloads at or above the operating system level. There's a lot of control with this model. There's a lot of visibility to some of these information elements. If you climb up to the PAAS level, the platform as a service level, this is really where you're having a layer of middleware sitting between your infrastructure and your data and your application. And this is also where you start to see containers and microservices start to enable some very granular security and logic that could power your workloads as well. Typically, this is where you see lots of synergies around interoperability as well. And then finally, if you climb up to the software as a service model, this is simply presenting your data to you to use and not necessarily having access to the data itself. So a little bit more detail here as we move forward. Going to be on slide 19 when that shows up. This is some of the characteristics of the SAS model. Really, this is to provide access to a web-based service. Software as a web-based service. It allows access to business functionality, usually at less cost than purchasing software outright. Some of the things that a customer can do is to have their applications running. They can access their data, at least from a thin client perspective. They cannot, however, manage any of the underlying infrastructure. They can't manage the network. They can't manage the servers or the operating systems or the storage or the capabilities, for the most part, of the application. So they can access, they can control the access to the application, but that's one of the limits of the software as a service model. On to slide 20. Again, some of the benefits of the SAS model are that it's easy to use. There's minimal administration. Automatic updates and patch management happen. There's lots of standardization and compatibility and global accessibility. I'm just going to skip past that slide, even though it's not fully rendered. And on to slide 21. The business associate agreement and the SAS model, really getting back to that discussion around the business associate agreement. The SAS provider really has to take a lot of responsibility for safeguarding your data. And your business associate agreement would likely have to have a more detailed focus on the responsibilities of the SAS provider. Keep in mind, though, as a data owner, you can never fully offload your accountability and legal liability for the data, but your SAS provider should be responsible not only for the foundational services such as the compute, storage, database, networking, the encryption, the OS, the firewalls, etc., but also the platform itself. And the application really is limited to the use of some configuration customization, but really, again, no real control or visibility exists. Sometimes this works great. Sometimes that's exactly what you want, and certainly Salesforce is a great example of that model. There's lots of covered entities now looking at cloud-based EMR SaaS tools as well. So we're starting to see that trend. Now let's move on to the platform as a service. Looks like that slide popped in pretty easily. In a PaaS environment, a customer can deploy an application that they have developed or purchased. They can use their own programming languages or libraries, other tools. They can control the deployment. There's a few more things they can actually do to develop and run and manage applications without the full complexity of maintaining the infrastructure. However, they can't manage the underlying infrastructure, including the operating system. Going to slide 23, some of the PaaS characteristics, platform as a service characteristics, include support for languages and frameworks, multiple hosted environments. There's lots of flexibility with a PaaS. This is really also a choice by many who want to try to avoid a vendor lock-in scenario. This is where they're now subject to just having one vendor that they can use, and sometimes they want to get away from that, and so they'll move up into a PaaS kind of platform. Again, as you start to think about a platform as a service model, your business associate agreement is going to have to reflect that model in the responsibilities of both you as well as the cloud provider for those specific areas of responsibility. We're going to talk about those specific areas in just a minute. Some of the benefits really include the fact that the OS can be changed or upgraded frequently. There's really one environment. It's globally distributed among your development teams. And the services are quite diverse. You can have resources from around the globe at a much reduced cost. You just certainly have to really be aware that certain global influences can be there, and if you don't do your due diligence on some of the open source items that are shared, sometimes you can get in trouble. But it's a fairly, it's a very robust way to deliver applications. Now, thinking about that PAAS model and the BAA, as I mentioned, you really have access to the above areas in the white. The data owner can process, they can see, they can control a lot of that. Down below that, operating system, client-side encryption, network traffic, foundational services, those are very limited control or visibility to the data owner or the processor. Going now to IaaS, Infrastructure as a Service. The characteristics of that is really that you can deliver your infrastructure as a service. Software and services are purchased as fully outsourced, and they're usually billed on usage. Sometimes there's fees that are fixed fees that aren't based on usage, but for the most part, it's all usage-based. The customers can really do a lot more here. They can provision their storage, their networks. They can deploy and run arbitrary software and applications. They can possibly control some of the network components. And one of the things they can't do, though, is manage or control the underlying infrastructure below the hypervisor level. On to slide 26. Some of those characteristics really include lots of scale, lots of converged network and IT capacity. There's lots of self-service and on-demand capacity that can happen in an IaaS environment. Lots of reliability and resilience, and the benefits also include the fact that you can manage your OS. You can really see reduce costs from having to build your own infrastructure. Some of those players include, the folks that you see on the page there, Amazon and Microsoft, and others that are more specialized on the VMware-based clouds, such as the SoftLayer. So again, if you look at the BAA and the IaaS model, customer accountability is really still around the patient data, the applications, and the identity and access management, less so on the foundational. And then you've got in the light blue there, you've got a really good shared responsibility model with the cloud provider. And we'll kind of show you how that can vary based on some of the cloud providers as well. But I wanted to show you this slide because it kind of gives you a visual, a comparison, a side-by-side. It helps you understand what types of information are available to you given the service model. Again, this is slide 28. And so maybe, if you read this chart from the left side, those are the types of information you would have access to. And going from the local deployment methodology or service model, that's really where you're building your own infrastructure, you're managing all of it. You'll have access to everything. You'll have access. You'll also have the headache of making sure that you have to patch everything, make sure that your networking is all set up, your IP addresses are correct, and all that stuff. So this presents a lot of effort, sometimes a headache. And as you move to the left a little bit, you'll start to see that some of the information is less visible. As you move to an IaaS model, you'll start to see foundational levels that won't be accessed. You'll have very little information from the foundational side, but you will see the OS, the middleware, the runtime data, those kinds of things. Platform in the middle, PAAS. Again, you start to lose access to certain types of information or services, but your platform provider would take care of those, and you would start to see really more of your data, your application, your access control. And then finally, SAS is really your presentation of your data. You have very limited control of the application. You don't get to go in and tune your database, for example. You just get to see your information. You get to run reports. You can certainly export it, but you also retain your access controls. So again, it can be a very effective service model. but you certainly have to look at your workload through the eyes of which service model you want it to go through. So as a cloud customer, couple of ways to look at this. You can go to a cloud, a public cloud, and you can certainly take on the do-it-yourself cloud relationship, and that is where, again, you would not have responsibility for the cloud foundational services, but you could maintain or you could build all the functionality around the rest of the duties of a cloud provider. For example, you could be responsible for your own client-side encryption and your server-side encryption and your network traffic and all of your OS and network and firewall and platform and all that stuff up the stack. Some entities like to do that. Some have actually said, hey, you know what? Maybe we want a managed cloud provider to help us manage those operating systems and the encryption and all those other things on top of the foundational services. So let's try to share responsibility there. So again, that's kind of the ClearDATA model, but this is really where the shared responsibility model starts to bear out. So going to slide 30, what I wanted to do here was present to you a HIPAA security rule RACI. So RACI is really a diagram of who's responsible, who's accountable, consulted, and informed. These are the basic elements of the HIPAA security rule. These are the high-level categories that you need to think about in the HIPAA security rule. So again, these can change depending on the use case. Overall, we see that the business associate and the covered entity are joined at the hip. The service provider would be the managed cloud provider, and the cloud provider itself would be those foundational services. And so, for example, when you talk about workforce security on line 3 there, the covered entity, assuming that's the end client, is accountable and responsible for workforce security. So is the business associate. The cloud services provider and the cloud provider itself certainly have to have that in place, and that's why you have your auditors come in and validate that your own workforce security is there. But as that relates to your own specific workload, those are things that both of you have to do. Incident procedures, for example, maybe the covered entity is still responsible or still accountable for an incident procedure. The business associate is certainly looped into that, and the service provider would be consulted and informed in that. Now again, your interpretation may be different, and given 1,000 different scenarios, you could have 1,000 different types of RACIs. But this is really a chart that we use quite a bit to help delineate who's responsible for what. Audit controls, for example. Accountable, the covered entity needs to know, how access to the data has happened. Patient, again, has a right to know the disclosures of their PHI. So if they use a business associate, the business associate is partially responsible for helping them adhere to those requirements, and so is the service provider and the cloud provider. So just a way to look at the HIPAA security rule in a little bit different way. Now, if we get a little bit more specific, for example, in an infrastructure as a service deployment model, looking at a RACI here with a little bit more technical, detail, as soon as this slide pops up on slide 31. The use case scenario for this RACI would be that a covered entity has has decided to deploy a cloud-based appointment setting application within its medical groups. Maybe they have a business associate that helps them with that, who either developed it or who is responsible for managing it. They have their infrastructure that is managed by a dedicated healthcare cloud provider, and the infrastructure might be located on a public cloud. So if I look at the RACI to the right, who's responsible for doing things like provisioning the storage and the networking and putting in place a breach notification plan that rolls up into the covered entity and the business associate. So in this simple model, the services provider, the managed services provider, will be accountable and responsible for doing these types of activities, ensuring the backup and the application installation and monitoring and making sure that the vulnerability scans happen. If you look down at the bottom of that chart, however, you'll see the little apps rectangle, vertical rectangle there, where you see provision the application and the services instance, and you see the CMS install and the setup and maintenance. Maybe the business associate that manages that application is responsible and accountable for those types of activities. And so as we go into any kind of a deployment of some infrastructure on the IaaS model, we will always sit down with the customer and map out a RACI model that helps to manage the expectations related to who's responsible for what activity. I recommend that you do this in your own practice. It simply helps you understand who needs to be doing what, and it certainly helps with your own success in deploying to the cloud. Moving along, so that's kind of a high level. As I kind of bring it back to reality here, one of the things that I would recommend as you contemplate or continue to move to the cloud, make sure you know your workload requirements, integration requirements, certain dependencies. Make sure you understand your architecture and your compliance and security requirements. Those types of workload requirements will be very important for you to understand and fit those workloads into the service model that meets those requirements. So for example, once you look at your workload requirements, now measure it up against the service model. Different models have different levels of control and information access, as you have seen in a couple of slides ago, hopefully. Certain applications lend themselves more to a SAS model. Some are great on PAAS. Some are great on IaaS. The interesting part about the business associate agreement here is that for certain cloud providers, it's difficult to determine how to manage all of the things that a customer needs if there's very limited access. And so your cloud provider needs to be aligned with your service model in terms of how they can support you and your needs from that business associate agreement. So make sure you don't go down the path of just simply selecting a cloud provider based on the technical requirements. Marry in those legal requirements as well. And then finally, my recommendation is to create that RACI with your provider up front. Really map out your responsibilities. Sometimes you can even put that in the contract as part of the SLA. And then review that on a regular basis to ensure that the responsibilities that each party has undertaken, make sure that they are reviewed on a regular basis and help each other be successful along that journey. So with that, I appreciate all of your attention and your bearing through the slides that have been a bit slow to present. I would love to answer any questions, Mike.
All right. Thanks, Chris, for a great presentation. And I, too, apologize for the technical difficulties, but just a reminder that we'll be sending a link to this recording and a copy of the slides later on. In the meantime, we have time for some questions, so let's get started. Chris, what are some of the common types of audits we should look for when we're selecting a cloud provider as part of the due diligence process?
So if I'm a customer, a cloud customer or potential customer, I will, my area of expertise is healthcare technology. So using that, and given the audience here, I would look for HITRUST as a great one. I know that some people love HITRUST, some people don't, but HITRUST envelops lots of different controls, for example, around ISO, around COVID and other operational types of controls. It's a very robust framework. You'll probably also want to look for somebody who has validation of those controls, some kind of a report on those controls. And so SOC 2, Type 1 and 2 help to provide you some assurance there from a third-party validation perspective. But beyond that, there's many different certifications, many different audits that can happen. If you're into messaging, for example, you might be looking for an ENAC certification or ENAC audit. Maybe you're looking for alignment on FDA Class 1, and so you have your own ISO standards that you use for that, or at least having mock audits that help with some of those types of workloads. But it just depends on your needs, but I would really strongly recommend at least the SOC 2 and the HITRUST.
Another question here. We know that a data owner can't fully delegate all liability, but is there a way that we can use insurance to help offset some of that risk?
Insurance is a very interesting question, and I think you're starting to see the insurance industry start to understand this whole phenomenon of PHI. It's interesting that the number of records that you manage does not always translate directly to the premiums that you pay. A lot of times your insurance companies will look at all of the operational controls and the security posture that you use to protect that data. That said, if you're signing up with a cloud provider and they have certain, or you have as a customer certain insurance requirements, bring that up. Ask for the limits that you think would be necessary in the event that the service provider causes a breach or causes some kind of an error. That doesn't fully absolve you from your own errors. So if you, as a customer, create your own issue by sharing passwords or downloading that ransomware onto your systems, you'll need to have your own coverage. Types of insurance available to cover this really include breach notification is an actual policy you can get. Cyber insurance, which would cover your normal types of breach incidents. Regulatory insurance would cover some of the fines. Certainly that would also be married with your general E&O. I'm not an insurance expert, but I do have experts that I consult with on that topic, and it's a very interesting question.
Someone else is wondering, why would I choose SAS over IaaS in general?
In general, if you only need to see your data, and you don't necessarily need to manage much more beyond that, SAS might be a great model for you. But again, it depends on the SAS application and whether that application can be sufficient to meet your business needs. CRM, for example, is one of those that is fairly common, and so that's why a lot of folks use Salesforce for that kind of thing. EMR, EHR is starting to get more and more common as well, and so you're starting to see some of the use for that model versus trying to manage all the way up the stack into IaaS.
Recalling that earlier question about insurance, someone else is wondering what types of insurance are available to cover breach or failure of compliance?
I think, and I saw that, so I kind of weaved my answer into that question as well, where we talked about the cyber, the regulatory, the E&O, those kinds of things. I still recommend that you get your own insurance expert to help you through that. I don't think a normal, I'm a great State Farm fan, love the Jake commercials. I use them myself personally, but sometimes you need like a more specialized approach where you're potentially using a Lloyd's or an AIG or some others that are more specific to some of these large payloads in the cloud.
Gotcha. Another question here. Are there typically cloud service providers that specialize in each of these different cloud service models, or are the three models typically just different options provided by each of the providers?
Well, that is a great question. What we've seen is that the more focused the better. I think I can speak from our own example where ClearDATA really helps to manage the vertical in healthcare. We typically focus on IaaS because we can use our business associate agreement to assume a lot more responsibility, which helps our customers. That said, you will have very specific players that may be platform oriented. While some of the major platform players names escape me, you may have Google be really focused on a platform. You may have Apple using their Apple Health to try to focus on a platform, or Samsung. And then, of course, you have your SaaS provider. So I think there's a lot of differentiation. Anybody who tries to do all things for all types of workloads either has to be really, really big and have lots of resources to focus in each area, or they really need to focus. And my preference would be to go with a cloud provider that focuses on your vertical and your deployment model.
All right. Well, I don't see any further questions rolling in. Chris, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up.
Yeah, again, I appreciate your time and the opportunity to share this information with you. Again, going back to the 3 points I made on that last slide, understand your workloads, map those workloads to the service model that you think would be best, and then make sure that you do your RACI and your shared responsibility model up front. That'll save a lot of heartache, and it'll help you manage your own expectations as well. And I thank you for your time.
Well put. Thanks, Chris. Before we wrap up, I would just like to ask the audience to please take part in the session evaluation that will appear on your screen at the conclusion of the webinar. So thanks again for joining us today, and you'll receive an email in the coming days with a link to the replay of this webinar for you to watch again or share with a colleague. So thanks again, and have a great day.